They're still eating pretzels. Our next speaker is Dr. Michael Barbato. He works for the Food and Drug Administration in the Division of Oncology. He performs clinical regulatory work, analyzing safety and efficacy of drug trials for the FDA. He's going to go through his bio a little bit more. But what I did, I asked Dr. Barbato to talk about the drug development process at the FDA. Again, more so from background information, so again, you know what's going on, research isn't stagnant, none of this stuff is stagnant, it's constantly changing and moving. So I did ask him, to talk about another arm of the neuroblastoma research process and the landscape and how we get from like point A to point B. So he's going to talk about the drug development process for pediatrics. Thank you.
Thank you, Pat. Hello, everybody. Again, I'm Michael Barbato. I'm a physician with the FDA. And I just kind of want to start by saying we're kind of all here for the same purpose. You can raise your hand if you want. I'll raise mine if you know anybody affected by neuroblastoma. And I think that's pretty much everybody here. And that's an important aspect of what I'm going to talk about today, too. During this session, I hope that you will learn that the FDA's role in pediatric oncology drug development. The key points to understand in this is that the FDA can sometimes take years to evaluate a new drug application, and we often encourage advocates from patients to physicians to other groups to join in those decision projects through meetings such as Accelerate, as well as the Pediatric ODAC subcommittee. And then there are also ways patients can receive some of these drugs on trials, which would be the formal process through the drug development, as well as off-trial, which would be individual or expanded access. And then during this meeting, you can feel free to ask a question. If you see something on a slide you want to ask a question about, or you can wait till the end. I think there's like 15 minutes for questions. And then, as we all know, the FDA is a regulatory body, and so I am a regulated body, and so you may see me reading from the slides fairly often because there's some precise language that I'll need to state based on their terms. So if you see me doing that. Okay. This is the disclosure slide. I have no financial disclosures, and I'm not going to be talking about any specific drugs that are on label or off-label. This is a quick topic overview. We're going to talk about what physicians do at the FDA, the core development process, what expanded access is, and how we address challenges to developing pediatric cancer drugs. I just want to talk about my personal background. So you can see this is a map from Baltimore, where I live, all the way up to here, where we're presenting today. That is a picture of the FDA campus at White Oak, where I work. I work in Building 32. And quickly, a little bit more about my history. I did my pediatric oncology fellowship at Johns Hopkins and NIH, and I'm currently working at the FDA, and I hope to join the rare tumor clinic at NIH in just a couple weeks. So that'll be part of my, my work. And then I wanted to share just a quick thing about some of my patients that I've been seeing with neuroblastoma, which is why we're here. And I want to emphasize 2 points. Even though I'm at the FDA, I think all of us think, we're clinicians first and we have the patient in mind. So when we're looking at all these applications to regulate these drug trials, we're thinking about the faces of our patients. And I certainly do. I think about a lot of my patients who have left a huge impact on me. And so that's the other thing. And also, we have to expect the unexpected at the FDA. When we're looking at the toxicity profiles of some of these drugs, we have to see what could possibly come up in our risk-benefit analysis. So this is a sort of a busy slide, but it's just an overview of the different centers at the FDA. There are many cogs in the wheel moving drug development in the United States. The Oncology Center for Excellence is the central gear with several main branches. The Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, CDER, is responsible for evaluating and overseeing many of the drug products for use in oncology. CBER and CDRH drive approvals for biologics and devices. Housed within CDER are several divisions The relevant division to us here today is the Division of Oncology 2, which is responsible for doing many of the drug products for use in rare pediatric solid tumors, such as neuroblastoma. It's also the division where I work at the FDA. Division of Oncology 3 works with Ewing sarcomas, and Division of Hematologic Malignancies 1 and 2 work with pediatric leukemia lymphoma. Here is a picture of my team my team leaders, as well as my colleagues. This was actually at a baby shower of one of our people who is off on maternity leave right now, but she's right there in the middle. So that's who works on these drug products at the FDA. So these reviews are multidisciplinary, and I want to stress that. So we have quality of the product we have to review, pharmacology, toxicology, clinical pharmacology, clinicians like myself, and we have statistics and project management, such as who organizes all the paperwork. That's a big deal when you're dealing with thousands of pages on many different topics. So what do people like me, physicians at the FDA, do? At FDA, we review and oversee clinical trials, applications to assess efficacy, safety, and overall risk-benefit. We also do stakeholder outreach to patients and other experts, and much more, which I'll get into in a minute. At FDA, we do not regulate practice of medicine. For example, a physician may prescribe a drug or treat a disease or a side effect in different ways in different centers, and we do not regulate the practice of medicine. Another example of that, if a drug is FDA approved for use in adults, but not in pediatric patients, a physician can still prescribe the drug, and patients can receive it through off-label use, and we do not set pricing of drugs in any way. When we review drug products, we have a patient population at the center of our decision-making, because pediatric patients deserve and need more drugs that are specifically for their use and are rigorously studied and determined to be safe and effective. Here are a few articles that highlight the role of patient advocacy in pediatric drug development. The first article highlights how academic sponsors and industry partners have transparent collaboration, and knowledge sharing opens an important pathway for accelerating new treatments into clinical practice for children with cancer. On the first one, the critical role of academic clinical trials, there was a patient advocate who was one of the authors. Her name is Donna Ludwinski, as well as our former head of pediatrics at FDA, Greg Riemann, who is now at the NIH, was also one of the authors on that paper. The second article is by all patient advocates and discusses the importance of pediatric patients in clinical trials for innovative cancer therapies. Also listed here is the agenda for the Pediatric ODAC of 2022, where we met to discuss a novel endpoint, response to induction chemotherapy, or therapy, because more than just chemotherapy, that we look at in clinical trials of patients with high-risk neuroblastoma. A patient advocate provided a great perspective about the need for accelerating research in high-risk neuroblastoma during that process. Patient-focused stakeholder engagement occurs in a variety of ways at the FDA. Some of these include conversations and cancer sessions, which allow public dialogue between experts, patients, and caregivers on specific topics. For instance, I did one last fall on oncofertility, which is an important topic in my life and something I've worked for since fellowship to try and bring awareness and advocacy for oncofertility. So I'm excited for the next talk. Mini symposiums are another more formal way of presenting cancer topics and engaging experts and patients advocates as speakers with specific education goals. FDA fully supports and recommends inclusion of advocate representation at all stages of drug development for pediatric cancers, such as protocol design and FDA meeting participants. FDA fosters openness and encourages suggestions regarding future projects for patients and in the community. So the next section is going to focus on drug development. So you may have heard about phases of drug development. Different phases in practice can sometimes blend or overlap, but the general goals of phases of therapy are to stagger drug exposure in a less to more gradient to gain insight into safety and of efficacy of drug prior to its commercial use. Regulatory standard for FDA approval of new drugs requires substantial evidence of effectiveness derived from adequate and well-controlled investigations. Clinical benefit may be observed by showing an improvement in survival or quality of life, which is a traditional approval. Regarding the use of early endpoints, an effect on an early endpoint that is reasonably likely to predict clinical benefit or on the basis of an effect on a clinical endpoint other than survival or irreversible morbidity. That would be an accelerated approval. So for example, in November of 2020, FDA granted accelerated approval to naxitamab in combination granulocyte macrophage colony stimulating factor for pediatric patients 1 year of age and older with relapsed or refractory high-risk neuroblastoma. This approval was based on the observation of durable response and tumor shrinkage. Generally, the types of cancers in pediatric patients and adults differ in etiology and biology, and organ of origin and natural history, which has sometimes resulted in pediatric trials not being required under the pre-FDARA iteration of PREA. And I'll talk more about those regulations in a moment. The requirements were waived because the drug in question was being developed for cancer that rarely or never occurs in children, thereby making the necessary studies impossible or highly impractical. In patients are generally exempt from PREA assessment requirements under Section 505B, that's an FDA regulation, because they are for indications for which orphan designation has been granted. Sorry, that was a lot of regulatory talk. So a quick question before we get into more pediatric-focused areas. So the number of FDA-approved drugs for pediatric cancer is, give you a moment to think about it, but I'll just give you the answer. It's over 50. We've done with 70 indications for treatment of pediatric cancers. So considering all of this in recent years, there have been over 80 pediatric oncology specific approved drugs. Here are some of these approved drugs, and several of them have multiple indications. You can see some of the drugs we just talked about today are on this list, and these have been approved between 2020 and 2023. There are many more prior to that, but these are the most recent ones. So, expanded access. At FDA, we encourage development of promising drugs for pediatric cancers with the goal of approval in pediatric population. However, prior to the approval of expanded access is another important way for pediatric patients to access drugs outside of clinical trials. Expanded access allows the use of investigational drug to treat a patient with a serious disease who has no other satisfactory options, with an intent to treat, also called compassionate use. This is in contrast to using an investigational drug in a clinical trial where the primary intent is research. Expanded access programs focus on three main types: the individual, the intermediate, and also treatment. For individual expanded access programs, a physician must determine probable risk from drug does not exceed that from disease, and take into account other factors that may be risks or benefits. FDA will consider possible harm to the patient and the scientific body of evidence for the drug product as evidence for likelihood of an efficacious response. FDA allows 99% of expanded access programs to proceed. And in order for patients to receive the drug under expanded access, the company must agree to provide their drug for that purpose. So this just has a little bit of information about expanded access and Project Facilitate. So under the Oncology Center of Excellence, Project Facilitate is a single point of contact call and information center created to help oncology healthcare providers or regulatory professionals submit expanded access requests for individual patients with cancer through FDA's expanded access program. If you want to learn more about this program or have an emergency IND request, the contact information is here and listed again at the end of this presentation. Here is the data on Project Facilitate. So this graph is shared directly from the head of Project Facilitate, and the bars indicate the number of applications received by age group, and between 2020 and 2023. There have been over 400 applications for patients less than or equal to 17 between this time period. So a lot of people are utilizing this program. And this graph is from Project Facilitate again and displays the time to process an individual application. You can see that the vast majority of applications are reviewed in less than 24 hours and approved. Most applications come from academic centers. And here's some historical data spanning between 2015 and 2020, specifically on single patient INDs granted in the pediatric neuroblastoma population. You can see that each year there's about 1 to 2 dozen patients in the pediatric realm for neuroblastoma receiving these. Here are a few familiar drugs, products as examples of access through these expanded access programs prior to approval. Through expanded access, over 800 patients were able to receive dinutuximab before it was approved. Also Erwinia, over 1,500 patients, and Unituxin, as I said, greater than 800 patients. Addressing the challenges of pediatric drug development. There are many challenges to the pediatric cancer drug development. Some of these include increased financial risk due to the rarity of pediatric cancers. Trial designs may be limited by rarity, making it harder to have a timely and robust randomized trial. Further characterization of cancers based on a tumor biologic characteristics presents accrual challenges. For example, medulloblastoma is subdivided into 4 subtypes, each potentially with its own therapeutic strategy. There is an upside for potentially dramatically increased effectiveness for small subgroups. To address the need for pediatric cancer drug development, FDA has implemented several incentives and requirements for drug developers. Incentives include the Best Pharmaceuticals for Children Act, BPCA, which provides additional marketing exclusivity to sponsors who voluntarily complete pediatric clinical studies, outlined in a written request issued by FDA. Another incentive is the Rare Pediatric Disease designation, where a sponsor who receives an approval for a drug for a rare pediatric disease may qualify for a voucher to receive priority review of a subsequent marketing application for a different product. In addition, FDA will award priority review vouchers to sponsors of rare pediatric disease product applications that meet certain criteria. Prior to FDARA, there were no requirements due to orphan exclusion, and because pediatric cancers are generally distinct from adult cancers. Laws addressing pediatric drug development include the Pediatric Research Equity Act, PREA, which I mentioned before, and the amendment by the FDA Reauthorization Act of 2017, FDARA. So PREA requires a pediatric study based on clinical indication, and FDARA requires a pediatric study based on molecular mechanism of action, and this was implemented in 2020. A little history on the written requests. Over 40 written requests have been issued by the Office of Oncology since 2001. Clinical trials included in 23 of the written requests have been concluded as of 2021. There are 29 ped-onc drugs granted exclusivity. For example, a recent use of this program was for dabrafenib and trametinib, which received approval for the treatment of pediatric patients with low-grade glioma in the spring of 2023. And this was completed based on the requests from a written request. In a few ways we can continue to improve are to have early and frequent engagement among stakeholders to prioritize agent investigation and development, assess research strategies and harmonize goals, and increase efficiency. And the Pediatric Oncology Program holds the Pediatric Oncology Product Development and early advice meetings with sponsors to discuss pediatric development plans. We also hold various meetings with stakeholders, including the Pediatric Subcommittee of the Oncologic Drugs Advisory Committee, the Oncology Subcommittee of the Pediatric Review Committee, PERC. It's a very long committee, as well as other public outreach meetings. One of the goals of pediatric oncology advocacy is to change the perception of clinical trials in pediatrics from the notion of protecting children from research to protecting children with research. For instance, last year, May in 2022, as part of the ongoing advocacy with FDA, the Pediatric Oncology Subcommittee of Oncologic Drugs Advisory Committee met to discuss the potential utility and steps to validation of an intermediate clinical endpoint, response to induction chemotherapy, and the development of new drugs for the first-line treatment of patients with high-risk neuroblastoma. I mentioned that in the beginning, and this is just to kind of tie it all up. With another subcommittee, meetings have focused on glioma, early endpoints, and drug dosing for pediatrics specifically. As we all know, drug dosing for pediatrics is much different than in adults. At FDA, there is a global and collaborative approach to pediatric cancer drug development and access. One way this is done is through Project Orbis. Project Orbis is a collaboration among international regulators to allow patients with cancer to receive earlier access to products in other countries where there may be significant delays in regulatory submissions, regardless of whether the product has received FDA approval. Accelerate Pediatric Strategy Forum is a multi-stakeholder platform where academic investigators, industry and regulatory agencies, and patient advocates share and discuss information and make recommendations to inform pediatric drug development strategies. The Office of Pediatric Therapeutic Pediatric Cluster meetings involve information exchange and discussion of specific product development safety concerns and general scientific issues with participating countries. These meetings help to avoid duplication of effort, unnecessary expenditure of resources, and design a comprehensive program to fulfill global regulatory requirements. Continued collaborative and effective communication and efforts among global stakeholders is a mandatory to fully leverage scientific discoveries and bring new treatments to children with cancer. The Pediatric Oncology Program at FDA encourages open communication with these stakeholders that includes all of us and most importantly, patients as well. Thank you, that is all.
Thank you, Dr. Barbato. Are we allowed to ask questions?
Yeah.
Anybody have any questions for Dr. Barbato? Oh, nope, we're leaving.
You had a slide that you said was going to be on the last slide that had the information.
Oh, yes. There you go. Resources.
Sorry.
No worries.
I was just wondering if we can get copies of your slides.
Yes, do you provide copies?
Oh, we can.
Is that-
Yeah,
is
that
that-
would be fine,
Okay, if that's
So-
okay. Okay, thank you.
of course.
Okay.
Yes, it was a lot of regulatory talk, so there was a lot to get through.
Anyone else have any questions? Oh, go ahead.
I may have missed the slide, but how long from start to finish does the drug development process take? And how
depends.
can we, or what's your best advice to us as
Sure.
parents on how we can help? Obviously, it's an approach that's going to take all of us stakeholders, but how do we get involved?
So there are a couple different ways. If you have a drug that you're already familiar with and you really like it and it's not approved yet, you can approach the FDA to try and join one of those subcommittees and be one of the guest speakers or write a letter and that type of thing for outreach. As far as the duration of the process, it can take many years. It can take a couple years depending on the trial and accrual and how rare the disease is. If there's only a few patients per year, it may take a very long time to get an adequate safety and toxic profile of that drug before it can be approved. But in that case, you could also get the expanded access to the drug through the Project Facilitate, which I mentioned up there.
Okay. Anyone else? And I think there's organizations out there too that do work, advocacy programs and stuff like that that you can contact as well, so.
Okay. All right.
Anyone else? Go ahead, Horace.
So one of the things that we always talk about in pediatrics are endpoints, and I'm glad you sort of brought that up. But
Sure.
Our issues are
Oh, goodness.
fact.
Roz, take it easy.
I
Take
did not
it
touch
easy.
that. How do we deal with these small populations of patients and proving efficacy, or what is our, how do we adjust our endpoints to deal with rare diseases?
So this is actually under a lot of discussion in the FDA currently. Like, how can we look at like time to event endpoints versus overall survival, and how can we use that information to best suit these trials and for our patients? And so it's a matter of discussion, and I don't have an answer for you today, but I know we are discussing it too.
Yeah, we need it yesterday. Thanks.
Okay. Anyone else? Come on up.
One of the issues seems to be that some of these trials that are cancer research or research investigators, like in adults and other cancers, will receive federal funding and don't turn in their work for years, or if ever, if I understand it, according to the moonshot. That was a big issue that was discussed there. Is there any possibility that could be, is that FDA, could there be some kind of linking that could help motivate that these reports are getting back to the government in addition to when they're trying to apply for approval?
So as far as getting them to submit documents in a more timely fashion?
Yeah, because sometimes they never turn them in.
So for the trials I'm familiar with, in my personal purview, I'm not sure about the ones that maybe that are delinquent. I'm not sure about that, but we do have various levels of submitting requests for extensions or specific timelines that we have goal dates that we do try to enforce, and we send letters of delinquency and things if they do not meet those standards.
No, I was just thinking of in terms of NIH funding, and they're not reporting to them, if there would be some kind of linking to provide some motivation or.
More of like a governing process for that. Yeah, that's a good question. We'll have to look into that.
Okay. Anyone else? Yeah, come on up.
Hi. I was wondering how similar the development process for drugs is between, say, adult cancers and pediatric cancers on a specific point. The reason that we have a conference like this with the parents and the doctors here is because there really is a lot of close cooperation between the doctors and research centers and the community that they're treating, so the parents and the patients. And so I was wondering whether or not that is similar to what you see in more common diseases, and whether or not, because we have such a close collaboration between all the stakeholders, really, maybe, I don't know how it goes up to regulatory bodies, but are there different options to approach regulation because all the stakeholders are already talking so closely?
Okay. Well, I can say one thing that you mentioned that kind of made me think was it is a small world in pediatric oncology. A lot of people know each other, and a lot of familiar names today even. And so there's a lot of communication between those experts and the drug companies, and we encourage that so that there's openness and that clear communication, clear guidance for what's going on right now in the treatment setting for those companies to sort of follow those guidances and get that information to them before they even come to us with an application for approval. And that way, everybody's on the same page as to what would be the next step and best for the patient.
So I have one more question.
Sure.
You mentioned the voucher program that is supposed to motivate companies to look at investing in pediatric drugs as well as adult drugs. How well has that gone? How many companies have taken advantage of that and have invested in developing pediatric treatments also?
So I don't have specifics on how many. off the top of my head, but the resource for the voucher program is in the resources page, so we can check on that later.
Thank you.
Okay, is that it?